Hi, and welcome back to Weatherford Daze. We are on week 4 of our month of focusing on children's stories.
The nostalgia of childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, reaching back.
And even though we were kind of like focusing in on some kind of individual things, for this week, we're going to broaden back up out just a little bit and talk about, well, my personal favorite type of kids story. Wait, is it your favorite too? Yes, no?
It it is, but it isn't. It's like it
Hmm.
there's things I like about it, and we can talk about that, but it's not my go-to, but
We
I
need to have an episode about dinosaurs or superheroes.
no, we did that one. We did dragons already, so you got me there. Oh yeah, I talked about Dungeons and Dragons, so I don't know what else am I? No, there's certain I'm sure some ideas I might have, but
We talked about both of those in the context of adults, though, not really children.
yes. And this episode, I'm sure, will touch on some themes that they've touched on. Magic, I'm sure, we'll bring up.
Yeah.
There's all these
Well, I didn't
interweaving
say.
connections.
We're talking about fairy tales.
Yeah.
But the thing is with that, what like you were saying,
Hmm.
we've talked about fairy tales in the past. And I'm sure that we'll talk about fairy tales in the future too. A
No
lot of
doubt.
my favorite authors have written fairy tales or have talked about fairy tales, fantasy, that kind of thing. So it's yeah, it's a cool topic and it's a big topic, and so we kind of were thinking what we were going to specifically focus on today was fairy tales and faith,
How they intersect, maybe.
and specifically for children. It's kind of one of those things that we know, a lot of times when you think about fairy tales, you think about, well, yeah, that's for kids, right? But what does it do for kids? Is it good? Is it maybe potentially a negative thing? And how does all that work? So we're gonna talk about that a bit. Hopefully we get to everything.
I think that it's coming back around because it wasn't always meant specifically for kids, even though it was told to children many times. Adults could enjoy them as well. They had certain things in there that only adults, I think, could relate to. Marriage, politics. There's those things are in there. You know,
Well, I think
having a
that
job. I mean, too
the
many kids.
purpose of fairy tales has always been to teach kids about life in a way that they could understand, right? And relate to.
But also entertain. Sure.
Mhm. There's an entertainment, but I think that the purpose of fairy tales, because it's so specifically a learning and a teaching tool for kids, I think that the purpose has always been just contextualizing life for them, and more than just entertaining. I think, it's kind of like Aesop's fables. The purpose of Aesop's fables was to teach a moral lesson.
Right.
There was a point to it. And I think that especially when it comes to children and the things that we teach them and that what we, invest heavily into, we want it to be something that is helpful, that has a purpose. We don't tend to do really anything with our kids because it's such, kind of a short time period that you have your kids. We try to be, as adults, we try to be very intentional
Mm.
with what we expose them to and with what we're teaching, that we actually are teaching.
Mm.
So, fairy tales is something that has been around for a very, very long time. And while, I know that I've seen a lot on YouTube about kind of the dark side of fairy tales and where those, the origins of it and that kind of thing. And then, something happened, right? Where it stopped being so much fairy tales for adults, where it's teaching them something, as it became fairy tales are for children. There was
Yeah,
a
there
turn
was a
there.
switchover.
And I think, honestly, a lot of people kind of put that down to Disney. right?
Yeah.
But I think that maybe it started, a little bit before Disney. I don't think that we can put all of it on Disney, but I think that Walt Disney was a big factor in that.
I was thinking of the phrase pulled punches because it's not that fairy tales were dark, it's that they were very matter of fact. There was elements of fear, of danger, of warnings, of curses and things like that. And
Mhm.
there were villains, and sometimes there were bad choices, or there were situations that weren't always so cozy. And they sometimes they would wrap up and with a happily ever after, or to the end of their days, or something like that. And that's wonderful. But many times they kind of, I've read a couple of them where they just kind of go, and then this happened, and that was that.
Mm.
And they go by, they're so quick, but they're so universal that you want to hear them again. And I honestly think it's not that they're dark, it's that they have something they don't.
I think that it's
Yeah.
that they weren't originally necessarily created for children. They were, I think, in the beginning, a learning tool for adults. And then we kind of did change it and we softened them a little bit to make it where it was appropriate for children, which you know, I think that's a fine thing to do. I don't think that, you know, but at the same time, I think that maybe Walt Disney, in some cases, took it a little bit too far. I know that to me, I did not like that The Little Mermaid was changed so much that you lost really the lesson with Disney. I feel like, Cinderella, there's a lesson. Snow White, there's a lesson. Beauty and the Beast, there's a lesson. Aladdin, yeah, maybe we lost the lesson a little bit.
Well,
But Little
yeah.
Mermaid, it's gone completely,
Well,
or
don't
it's
the
changed
don't
to where Hans Christian Andersen would not recognize his story at all.
in the Disney movie Tangled, I don't see any situation. Tell me if I'm wrong, if I remembered it wrong, but he didn't fall into some thorns and get blinded and wander
Mm.
around until he found her again, and she healed him with her tears. I don't remember that in Tangled.
But there is still a lesson being learned. There's still a character arc that Flynn Rider has to go through where he's learning to, I guess for him, it's caring about somebody other than himself. And you see this very traumatized kid that, grew up really, he was the only one that cared about himself, right? You hear his backstory. And so, yeah, it's not in any way the fairy tale version, but the
The
fairy
fairy
tale
tale is
version
very,
is very kind of small.
yeah.
And the story of Tangled is really broadening that story a lot, but you still have a lesson that both Rapunzel had to learn and Flynn Rider had to learn. And there's a character arc. And I think that the lesson that is learned there is actually really good. But, you contrast that with The Little Mermaid. The lesson that she learns is literally what? Rebel against your father, go off and do what you want to do, and it's all going to turn out okay in the end.
Well, in the fairy tale,
Like,
she
I really
doesn't
feel
end
like
up
the
with the
lesson is
prince.
for the father.
She
In
doesn't have a happily ever after. You don't always get what you want, I
Right.
think, is what the original. That's something that kids, they're like that. You know, I mean, do kids always want a happy ending? Our kids, at least one of our kids, gravitated a lot towards the series of unfortunate events books, and those kind of had a little bit of a sometimes bittersweet or downer or darker ending to them, and she likes those just fine. So I think that, are we being too careful with our kids? I think we can. There's a balance we can have with that.
Mm.
Is let them know that there is danger, but remember the G.K. Chesterton quote about the dragon.
Mhm.
It lets you know dragons can be defeated, and sometimes it can be through being clever and or humble or not judging things by appearances, and looking at the heart of a situation. So those are all really great things you can pull, but if you soften it too much, you lose some of the original and maybe make a new moral, like
Mhm.
the Little Mermaid has a new moral, has a new story, new meaning to it based upon its adaptation and not necessarily what you got out of the original.
Yeah. And I think that the original, it's a cautionary tale. It's
Mm.
supposed to be that, I mean, what would you say is the actual moral of Hans Christian Andersen's story?
I was thinking, from what I remember, it's she doesn't get the prince in the end.
She doesn't, but she also learns that what she wanted wasn't actually good for her. And that she had completely, because the thing is he was in love with someone else. He didn't love her. She didn't realize what love even was. But what she does in the end is actually self sacrificial, where she could have taken what she wanted and become honestly evil, if she had done that. If she had acted selfishly and had, because she was given a knife,
Right.
she was supposed to kill him and his new wife in order to regain her fins. That was what was going to actually,
Yeah, Disney would
give
never
her
do
back
that.
her
Yeah.
life because he had fallen in love with someone else and gotten married. And she was in constant pain when she walked because she wasn't ever supposed to be human. It wasn't, oh, this is who I was always meant to be. And, this is wonderful. And I'm going to fall in love. Even if the prince hadn't been the one for her, if she hadn't had the pain, maybe she would have been able to be human. And I think that in the Disney remake, they kind of more focus on just her love of human versus her love of the prince and her wanting to experience the human world, and kind of made it not even about the love story, but about just, she was meant to be human. She was born in the wrong body.
Well, it's
But
part of your world. I think is really it's part of your world and not just part of your relationship. So there might be a good lesson from that is that she was longing for community of a different type. But the thing is, though, she had community. She just
mhm.
didn't realize it the whole time. You had a family.
But in the Hans Christian Andersen thing, she tried to become something that she wasn't, and it destroyed her. And she dies in the end, and she's mourned by her sisters and her family. She was loved, she was wanted, but she tried to do something and become something that she wasn't. And she didn't find a place in that other world. She wasn't accepted in. She didn't find love. She didn't get happily ever after. She learned that, she tried to become something that she wasn't, and it destroyed her. And that's not a story that would be very well accepted in our current
No,
world.
no, and there's a lot of other stories. One that I listened to this morning was about the fisherman. It's from Grimm's fairy tales, and he catches a fish. The fish can talk. He rescues it, finds it. Maybe there was like a prince or something like that had been shapeshifted into a fish, and he goes back home, and his wife goes, "Well, if he's a fish and he's magical, you could ask him for anything, and he'd give it to you." And she she says, "Why don't you wish for a lovely home? Because we have this little hovel and it's not much to it. Go back and ask him." And he goes, "Okay, fine, you have it." And he goes back and she has it. She goes, "Yeah, but this house is not so great." And then she keeps wishing for bigger and bigger. And finally, she's like the Pope or something. She's like the emperor above all. And then goes back and asks the fish to so she can be the Lord of the sun and the moon. And he goes, "Nope." And then she goes back to so be happy where you are. I guess is where
That reminds me of the story with the the husband store. Have you heard of that? It's like a little thing that I've seen on Facebook where somebody went into the husband store, and each, there's a different level. It's like a department store, and you can go, okay, on this first level you can get, like the basic husband, right? And then this next level, it's like, oh, well, this husband comes with this upgrade and this upgrade, right? And you keep going, and it's like the last one, I I wish I remembered it better if I'm going to tell it. But the last one is basically you get nothing. So if you had just actually been content with what was actually possible,
Right.
you would have had something really good. But you can't go back down. You've gone too far now. You were not content with what was actually possible. You kept wanting more and more, and then you've just lost out. Now you don't get a husband.
Well, in in
Is
in a
basically
in a way that story, of course, is used to not just talk about how a person is not content, but the story felt a little too much like they were kind of going, ladies, right? Am I right? And I'm like, oh, come on.
yeah.
So I think that all too often can be
But
some way that we throw rocks at
we
people.
also can go, women kind of have a proclivity to do this. And, I am okay with gender pointed stories
As long as it's equal
that you
opportunity,
go,
yeah,
yeah, but if we need to go, okay, yeah, I have the capacity to be like that and I need to learn from that and not be like that,
same.
that's okay. And the stories that are going to be pointed or targeted towards women's, yes, it is categorizing it as stereotyping, whatever. But if it's something that, is generally true for women or generally true for men, go ahead and stereotype and teach me. Not every woman is going to be like that. Not every man is going to be like that. But stereotypes are there for a reason.
Well, there's a lot of archetypes in fairy tales. They have the
Yes,
enchantress,
get us
or
back.
they have the enchantress, or the witch, or the ogre. Sometimes there's a clever character of humble origin, and somehow they are able to, through their own intelligence, make things happen, or their own really good choices make things happen, and they end up in the palace. And I mean, we tell our kids, if you really put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. And then you have, clever Hans, or these different kind of characters that just work their way on up by just using, cunning and intelligence. So those things get rewarded. I think not giving up gets rewarded, but also, you know, treating people kindly, no matter what they look like and no matter who they are. You don't want to get cursed that way. So there's little elements in there that teach you things, but they can't replace something like "and love your neighbor as yourself." I mean, that's something that comes from the Son of God, that comes from the Bible, and there appears to be much more applicability in what's in the Bible than what's in a simple fairy tale. But they have similar goals in mind, and that doesn't knock fairy tales, but the Bible has a lot more life changing material in it than a fairy tale, but they come from
Hmm.
similar origins, and can they work together?
I think so.
Okay,
And that's the thing. There's so many different fairy tales. Like, I know that we tend to think of just the ones that Disney actually turned into movies, but there's so many. And every single one has a moral and has a lesson to be learned. And they're told in ways that captivate the imagination. And that, I don't know, I feel like, you're getting a truth through a story, and it's not preached at you, it's not a sermon. And I think that, Jesus himself did exemplify how powerful that was with his parables. And I think that that's something that we, through fairy tales, we've tried to replicate how Jesus taught,
yeah,
the stories that he taught, and that we've tried to encapsulate those truths within these stories. And it's something that, can resonate throughout childhood into adulthood. And, just like we talked about with Lewis saying that, a story for a child, if it's good for a child, it can also be good for adults,
that's true.
right? That, a good story is good no matter who it's told to. There's truth there for you no matter what age you are.
And it's stealthy too, because
Hmm.
you're hearing it. Same with a parable, you're hearing it, and a story gets past your defenses, and you
Hmm.
start to hear it.
And there's
Yeah.
layers
Yeah.
that you can unpack to stories too. It's a way that you can hear this story and go, I'm processing how good and evil function in the real world. You're processing how the power of love, that love is stronger than death, just like through the story of Jesus conquering death for us, you also get the story of, you know, in Sleeping Beauty, right? You've got that she's sleeping and then love awakens her, right? That
And that's
determination of
true
the prince,
love,
him
but no
not
greater
giving up,
love hath any man. So,
right? But
yeah.
there was sacrifice in the prince, fighting through all of these obstacles that are thrown in his way to get to the princess, to rescue her, and to awaken her with a kiss. It's really love triumphing over evil. And I mean, how much can that parallel
Yeah.
with the love of God that is overcoming every evil, and every obstacle that Satan has thrown in his way to be able to redeem us? Like the stories of redemption, the stories of love triumphing over evil, of, just good overcoming all are there, and they parallel how God has actually worked for
What
us.
if somebody said, though, that believing in God is about the same as believing there's a fairy underneath a mushroom or something? That what's the difference between what the Bible says happened and someone saying once upon a time and doing that?
Yeah, that's something I definitely did want to get to, because it does, you go, if somebody believes in fairy tales, then is as a child, and they go, well, those weren't true and those aren't applicable to real life, you know, then is there a propensity for that person, that child who throws off fairy tales and dismisses them as just, magic doesn't exist in the real world, and, you know, these stories aren't real, then also going, well, the stories of God aren't real. It's just a fairy tale.
I mean,
Yeah.
the stories of the Bible did happen a while back,
Mhm.
and people can very quickly convince you that
That they're just made up.
the sands of time covered over these cities, or we didn't write everything down, or we didn't film it, it didn't happen. And then there's a distrust of people with historical fact.
So that is something that, I did specifically want to talk about. And I pulled up ChatGPT, which I thought that it was really good the way that it framed it. So
Yeah.
I want to just kind of go over what it said, because it put it a little bit better and more organized than what I did. So I typed in, can fairy tales more easily cause people to turn from God as adults, believing that it's all make believe? Because that was something that I kind of went, is there a danger there to teaching our kids make believe and stuff? And I what ChatGPT came back with was that fairy tales themselves do not cause people to turn from God, but how they are framed can shape how a person later understands faith. And I thought that was really, it got to the heart of it, I think. And it's when fairy tales are treated as just make believe, if children grow up hearing this is only pretend, magic isn't real, unlike real life, fairy tales are fantasy, the Bible is different because it's factual, then a problem can quietly form. As adults, some people may mentally place God, miracles, angels, and resurrection in the same category as fantasy, not because fairy tales misled them, but because imagination and truth were sharply separated. And when I thought about that, I was like, am I guilty of doing that for our kids? Because I do know that, when we talked about, when we introduced our kids to Harry Potter,
Yeah.
we went, there are witches in real life, and those, there is evil there. And that's something that we want to stay away from. And then there are the way that witches are presented in Harry Potter, and this is very much a make believe thing. The magic that they use is not real. It's not paralleling the way that magic is used in real life. There's this, imaginary. And in this story, there are themes of good conquering evil. You have, this very strong contrast between what is good and what is evil.
Right.
And your hero, even though he's using magic, this make believe form of magic, he's learning good truths. And so, I very much wanted to separate what was good and evil, but I don't know that I necessarily did it in a bad way. I'm hoping that I didn't. But it kind of makes me go, oh, now I want to go back with my kids and see, how did I actually present this? Did I present this in the right way? Did I do what I meant to do? And I'm hoping that I did. But, it goes on to say that in that sense, fairy tales can accidentally train skepticism if they are always presented as false stories for children instead of true stories in symbolic form. And yeah, I like the way that's worded. That there's, it's not that these stories are false, it's that they are make believe, but there's truth in them. And that, it doesn't, both things can be true, you know?
I would caution that, and I won't say too much about this, but I'll drop it real quick. One cautionary bit of that is something, while you were saying that, I thought of, and this is not a political thing at all. I mean, there's crossover, but I want to talk more about Jordan Peterson. He has been talking a lot about, he talks a lot about archetypal things,
Hmm.
like going into the belly of the whale and the monster. And he talks about it in terms of almost the way Joseph Campbell did. Joseph Campbell infamously wrote Hero with a Thousand Masks or something like that. Is basically, and that's where George Lucas got a lot of his hero's journey, the circular hero's journey thing that
Hmm.
you see in a lot of these stories, so embedded in there. But the way that Jordan Peterson talks about myth and all these different things as terms of archetypal human experience and morality or whatever. When he talks about the Bible, he'll be sitting with rabbis or pastors talking about the Bible with these mythic archetypal resonance type terms. And I'm like, and he consistently avoids saying, Jesus is real. Jesus is the Son of God. It's not, it's a true myth, as C.S. Lewis would put it, I think is right.
Hmm.
Um, it really did happen. And that's the danger that we can get into, is we can say, oh, there's so much in this Bible thing. And it's like, this is not metaphor.
Hmm.
Jesus Christ really existed. It's Jesus of Nazareth. He's the son of Joseph, son of God, died on a cross as a sacrifice for many. He did exist. Miracles did happen. It's so, a danger we can have is we look at the fairy tale as these these nuggets of truth, and then we look at the Bible in the same way, and we equate them and say the Bible's a fairy tale too, but there's such good stuff in it. It's like, not, no.
Yeah.
That's what I was getting at, is there's the danger of that.
Hmm. And I think that's where it goes with this. It
Oh,
says
okay.
that fairy tales functioned differently historically than the Bible stories.
Yeah.
So they were understood as stories that tell truth through imagination. They're not factually true, but they're morally and spiritually true. They teach what the world is like at its deepest level. When children learn that some truths are too big to explain without story, fairy tales actually make it easier to accept scripture later, not harder. C.S. Lewis himself said that fairy tales helped him recognize Christianity as myth become fact, a true story that fulfills the longings expressed in earlier myths and fairy tales.
They're types and shadows.
Mhm.
That's a phraseology that I learned a lot from some theologians that came to our church a lot. They use those types and shadows. They would talk about how Jesus is exemplified in the tabernacle, and he would need to break it down and go, okay, all the different parts of the tabernacle, they point to Christ, and types and shadows, and those are all Easter eggs that you can pick out of the Old Testament in terms of going to the New. But the thing is, you can do that with fairy tales too, but also don't fall into that trap of saying that just because we can pick truths out of fairy tales doesn't, and we can do the same with the Bible, doesn't equate them both. I do believe that we I, I do believe that you can dig into the dirt of the Holy Land and come up with
Mhm.
real physical people that existed. You can come up with Pontius Pilate inscription on a wall, but I don't know anywhere where someone goes, "Oh, here's the real Rapunzel." That's not
Hmm.
possible.
Here's how you climb up a beanstalk to the giant's castle in the clouds.
That's just metaphor. But
Yeah.
I don't think Noah and the flood was a metaphor. I don't think that Job was a metaphor. I do think that there are that the metaphors can be used, but and David of course did that as well. But that's not the be all end all for it. But yeah,
I want to finish up what it says
yeah, yeah,
here.
yeah.
It says people who abandon faith often do so because faith was presented as simplistic or fragile. Doubt and mystery were discouraged.
Hmm.
Stories were replaced with rules alone, and imagination was dismissed rather than sanctified. Like that is yeah. It says in these cases fairy tales aren't the cause, they're often the missing bridge. A healthy way to hold both. Children benefit when adults say things like, "This story didn't happen, but it tells us something true." God sometimes uses stories to teach us too. Jesus did this with the parables. We talked about that. Fairy tales help us recognize goodness, evil, and hope, just like the Bible does. This teaches children to distinguish truth from fact without rejecting imagination. So, fairy tales do not naturally lead people away from God. They only become a stumbling block when imagination is dismissed as falsehood and faith is framed as childish fantasy instead of deep truth. When imagination is honored and guided, fairy tales often prepare the heart for faith rather than undermine it. I liked that. Felt like, it kind of justified my feelings on fairy tales because I've always loved fairy tales. I've thought that they were very powerful and that they were a great teaching tool. So the idea that it's like, well, hang on a second, can they be bad in some instances? Can they actually, maybe is this not something that we should be using as a tool?
It's context. It's all in context.
Yeah,
How you frame it,
yeah.
and how you put it.
And to me, it does justify the teachings of Tolkien and of Lewis on stories and imagination and how those can be a bridge to faith. And just such a powerful teaching tool for truth that it doesn't lessen faith and Christianity. And the Bible, it I feel like it upholds them, it helps, it supports.
I think too often, wouldn't we just go, well, those are. I mean, it's the same. It's the same thing that people fall into when they go, oh, well, all fantasy is bad, and we'll just, and because of that, we're going to lose Lord of the Rings, and we're going to lose Chronicles of Narnia because, well, don't do that.
And
But
I know Christians that don't like Lord of the Rings because there are wizards in there.
yeah, but the thing is though that also chucking out all the fairy tales. Why? Because they describe a different kind of reality. I mean,
That's the thing. I don't feel like fairy tales necessarily do describe a different type of reality. Fairy tales are different than fantasy with, elves and that kind of thing. Most fairy tales are real world in some ways. Sometimes you may have, like Puss in Boots, you've got
talking
talking
animals.
animals, or you
Yeah,
have fairy godmothers that, you know, bring magic and, transformations and that kind of thing. But it's still based in real world, most all of
the
them.
very first time we actually hear them called out, they're called Märchen. It's a German word that they mean wonder tales.
Mm.
So the word fairy connecting with fairy tales, the land of fairy or fairy, it means just of magic. Uh, you go through all the fairy tales, and they actually only a handful of them actually have fairies in them. Is most time there may be an enchantress or talking animal or some other kind of thing, or you name it, but literal fairies, there's not that many of them in there. So it became kind of it's just synonymous with magical wondrous tales is basically the best that they could put that at. But fairy tale is a perfectly good description of it.
And something that I love is that there are so many fairy tale retellings that are happening that are still like that is a huge genre.
They're very archetypal. They're
Hmm.
public domain. uh, you can you can get tons of those. I got tons of those off of Gutenberg. That's where I got all of mine. But because they're so old and so archetypal and universal, that why not
I
pillage them for
remember the
ideas and
first
retellings?
the first retelling that I ever ran across was a Beauty and the Beast retelling. And I had
Didn't
not,
we talk about one of those early on? It was we did a Beauty and the Beast in one of our episodes. What about it was either Fated Mates or something?
yeah,
Is this the same one you're talking about?
no.
Oh, okay, new one. Here we go.
No. I ran across one when I was a teen,
Hmm.
and that was the first time that I had ever really run across a fairy tale retelling. I didn't realize how much of a thing it was. And then as I, gained more and more, it was kind of it just incredible to me how many people were taking these stories and telling them in completely different ways, and how
Yeah.
many times you could take one story and just completely change it and come up with an entirely new story and new lesson, and all of the things. So it's, you know if you like Beauty and the Beast, you can find 100 different retellings of Beauty and the Beast out there.
Some better than others. Yeah.
Yes, some definitely better than others, which I have a my list of favorite authors that I've run across. All of these are on Kindle Unlimited. And yeah,
Do you have any specific titles for the authors that you could
no,
suggest?
all of them have multiple that they've done, and there's so many more authors out there. These were just kind of some of the ones that I was like, these were just some of my favorites. I have read a lot of fairy tale retellings. That's one of the genres that I'll just kind of pop into when I'm feeling like I don't want anything really heavy. I just kind of want something light and fluffy. And if you type in a Kindle Unlimited, just, clean fairy tale retellings, you'll get thousands of options that come up. But yeah, like I said, some of my favorites are Deborah Grace White, Sherry L. Tapscott, Abigail Manning, which have talked about her before, Kenley Davidson, Brittany Fisher, K.M. Shea, which again I've talked about her before,
Mm-hmm.
but I talked about her urban fantasy
Yeah.
series, not her fairy tale retelling. She's got a great set of fairy tale retellings. She's one of my favorites. And then Melanie Sellier is the last one. Melanie Sellier is kind of one of those that she is one that I've recommended to my girls as just being something really kind of unique. Some of these, they're not Christian, but you can tell, like they're not obviously Christian, but you can tell that the author is Christian just with how they're weaving those truths into the story. And when an author does that with a fairy tale retelling, I really I love it. I love to see it. And Melanie Sellier is one that does that. Is just she's got this world that she's created that, all of her fairy tale retellings end up they're in like the seven kingdoms. And they're ruled by the High King, who has realized that, there's just kind of this evil sickness that's sweeping over the kingdoms, it's taking over. And he's determined that what needs and what's going to heal that is if the rulers of the kingdoms are ruled by true love. If, the king and the queen are actually in real love. So he is all about having his fairy godmothers go out throughout the kingdoms and actually orchestrating love stories in the young princes and princesses that are going to be taking over in order to help root out this sickness that's kind
Do
of
they
there.
have to be royalty, or can they be humble, like a
Well,
miller and a baker, and get them
either the
together and
prince or the princess, but yeah, the one that they fall in love with. See, the fairy godmothers, they're matchmakers, and they kind of have this unique way of finding the one that's supposed to be with the prince or princess
wonder
of
of
the land.
wonder, miracle of miracle.
Yeah. And they have these godmother objects that are kind of magical objects that they gift to someone to help their story come to pass. And so it's really cool the way
A
that
lot
it
of
does.
fairy
But
tale Easter eggs in there. You'll see something be like, ooh, that's from this, and
there are.
so this is almost like this is like you're doing that for like that I do like for Marvel movies. This is like the fairy tale cinematic universe, kind of thing going on there. Wasn't there a TV show called The Thousand Kingdoms or something where it took place and so they went to another realm and there was like ogres and all kind of stuff
The
and
10th Kingdom?
yeah, that was the one.
Yeah, that's a fun one. There's all
Any
kinds of
crossover that you have with
TV
these.
shows and movies that have.
Once Upon a Time
Mhm.
was a big one.
But I feel like the TV shows that I've seen have not been as well done as the books that I've read. I found a
Yeah.
lot of just really well done books. There's a lot of not well done books too, but there's some jewels out there.
The darker side of the fairy tales. I read a book. Now, don't watch the TV series, but the book is interesting. It's the series is what they made The Witcher from, and it connects like Germanic folklore and fairy tale kind of retellings, or this is obviously Beauty and the Beast, but they don't give them those names. It's almost like that's where we got some of those elements from, and then it works in a Monster Hunter kind of mythology character. But the 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 book is always better. Rachelism for this whole. But you're right. It did it does end up being better. But yeah, what was that one? You can tell me about if this counts or not. What was the one, Cinder or something, where it was like a
Mhm.
cyberpunk kind of sci-fi? Cinderella was like a
Now, I would say that that's not one that has kind of overt Christian themes to it.
right.
I mean,
Is it sweet though?
most, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I don't know. That one's got a little bit, it's not as sweet as others.
Oh, okay.
I think there's kind of levels of like, it's clean,
Okay.
but there's still some stuff that I would go, maybe an older teen, I wouldn't give that to a younger teen
Okay.
just
Okay.
because some situations are a little bit more harrowing and you kind of have to judge where your kid is and what their maturity level is for.
And you can parody those things too, as far as kind of tongue in cheek and a wink and a nod. I think Discworld don't they have little godmother kind of characters that they bring in there, and
Mm.
you know, uh, it's very fun to. It's a very
That's the thing though,
fun
it's
thing
like
to,
when you
to play
have
around in that world.
godmother that's very obviously pointing to the idea that there is someone in charge, there's someone in control, that it's not just happenstance that your story is happening this way, but that, it's being, that there's
Somebody,
a
somebody,
plan,
somebody looking out for you.
right? And that's those that you can very easily then connect to God, as the author of your story, as the
Right.
one that's orchestrating. And as long as you are being, a person of character, of high moral character, then your story is going to end well. And that, you can mess up sometimes, and there's help that comes in there and that's given to you. Like, all of those themes are just, teaching reliance on God, belief in a higher power, belief that there's more to your story than just you kind of lost in the world alone, you know, left to your own devices. And it's pure chance whether you're actually going to survive or, die.
I,
It's like, to me,
yeah.
that's one of the best things about a fairy tale and how it can connect to faith is this belief that there's more to your story, that there's something outside that's kind of controlling and bringing you to a place, that you're not left completely to your own devices, that when it feels like you're all alone, then it's like, oh, the fairy godmother steps in and helps you out, that the magical mystical stranger kind of, just happens to stop by and give you the exact thing that you need at the exact moment that you need it. It's, you're entertaining angels unaware.
Well, also one thing that people tend to come at fairy tales about is
Mm.
that you're not living in reality if you have a fairy tale mindset, and that there's just this handsome prince who's going to come sweep you off your feet, and you're going to be ushered into the palace and all this kind of stuff. I think there's a balance with, and we've always taught this with our kids, is that there's a real world. There's, the fantasy that you read and things like that, and being able to recognize and enjoy both those things and realize that, you know, we do live in a reality, but we don't live in a reality that's godless. We don't live in a reality that is devoid of miracle. We don't live in a reality that's devoid of the spirit and of
Mhm.
that. So you can enjoy both. And I think if you have a healthy, acceptance of what is, but also know that there's a God in this realm.
But the thing is that, while with the story of Cinderella, she went from hardship and being alone and ostracized and overworked and stuff to being a princess in a castle, and then it kind of leaves you there. I think that you still get the idea that there's purpose in the pain, that there's lessons to be learned from every hardship that you go through. I don't think that we necessarily need to have the idea from us, a fairy tale that it's like, oh, well, you've accomplished and you've learned the lesson and now it's happily ever after. I think maybe, that needs to be the part that changes sometimes is they lived happily ever after for a little while. And then there was another lesson that they had to learn because that's more realistic to how real life works, right?
But it's more
We
like
go through.
rest. You're existing in rest.
Mhm.
And you it didn't mean that, in this life you will have, tribulation, but he said, I have overcome the world. So, we were never promised a primrose path. There are going to be thorns. But the thing is, though, is realizing that you're not going through this path of life alone, and you're not going through it without some sense of strength.
And nobody goes through life miserable the entire time.
If you do, don't do that.
Well, if you do, keep pushing through because your story's not done yet.
Right.
It never just stops there and stays in misery. There's moments for everyone where you receive help, where you have hope, but there's those moments, always of rest and times when it's like, okay, at this moment, I have all of my needs met. You may turn around and have, another time of hardship and of lack, but everybody has those times when, you know, they have what they need. Even people who go through the hardest of times.
Right.
It's not hard every minute of every day. There's times of rest, times of peace, times that you can be thankful for.
We're not the only characters in the story. There are other people whose stories are being told too. And there is no main character of this in this life other than God. The rest of us are just in the story, and you're not meant to exist in the story alone. Your story is going to interweave with other people, and don't neglect that. Don't
But
go
at the
through it
same time,
alone.
we all do get to be the main characters of our own story.
Just be
And I
careful with
think
that
that
main
that's,
character energy, okay, people?
I think we need to be willing to have main character energy and side character energy,
But realize that
recognizing that we can be both.
have a realistic view of yourself and know that the world doesn't revolve around you.
Well, I know there is a whole lot more we could talk about. I've got notes that we didn't cover, and so do you, but once again,
Yeah.
we are out of time. So,
But here's the thing, real quick. We've touched on some of these different elements. We can't help but do that. We've touched on some of these different elements in other episodes we've done and episodes we will do.
mhm,
So this is not the last time we're going to mention archetypes and fairy tale and fantasy and magic. We're going to be
mhm.
talking about that till I'm completely old and gray.
And I think that it's going to be a recurring theme that faith can come through fairy tales, that you can, that they can be that bridge, like it said. And I'm going to keep coming back to that because I'm a child.
Of God, and that's
I'm a child at
that's
heart.
that's also how you've approached with our kids,
Mhm.
and we've talked about that. Yeah,
But I think even if my kids got to the point where they were like, "No, mom, we're too old for fairy tales," I'd still be like, "Yeah, you just got to get old enough to where fairy tales are applicable again."
I read some
I
for
don't think I
to
ever
prepare
grew
myself
out
for
of
this
fairy
episode.
tales. And I really do hope that that's something that the majority of people will just be willing to be open to the fantastical in the everyday world. And for me, yeah, it very much is connected to faith. Believing that, that there is this connection between this fantastical story and that it teaches truths about God. Anyway, yeah, we need to we need to end. So we will see you guys next time.
And they lived happily ever after. But that is another story,
Okay.
as you wish. Bye, everybody.